This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
It's a great pleasure this evening to welcome our speaker, Professor Michael Ullyot from the University of Calgary. Calgary, I visited, I was just reminiscing to Michael, I visited it when I was invited by his colleague Murray McGilvray back in 1997, I think it was. I went in January, and I remember that they kept saying on the weather forecast in the hotel that there would be a little light snow, and there was this constant raging blizzard outside, and I thought there must be some sort of issue about the weather forecast, and I asked about the hotel reception. He said, well, this is a little light snow. So I admire anybody from Calgary, and as I say, Calgary has been a terrific centre for quiet and a centre of real pioneering work in the digital humanities over the years, with a number of scholars there doing some very interesting work. And I'm delighted to hear that Michael is continuing that tradition, and indeed that Calgary is about to make further appointments in the area of the digital humanities. Michael works on a very interesting area of research of biographical self-consciousness in early modern England, which I think is a fascinating subject. And has published articles on elegies, anecdotes, modernized, Chaucers, very interesting subject indeed, and Senecan drama, so his range is enormously wide. But he's going to be sharing with us, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss quite fully, the work he's doing at the moment on developing protocols for encoding Shakespeare, which from the abstract Odyssey, he hopes, will actually kind of build towards a structure that could be more widely used in the study of early modern literature. So, Michael, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to London for this seminar.
Thanks very much. Do we want to turn the light
to make this
more visible?
That might be helpful, and I think they're at the back. I assume that the video is rolling. I don't need to do that. That's what I was assuming. It looked like there should be light switches.
Electric lines.
Well,
sorry about that.
We can leave it alone. That's fine. It's just some text will be less legible at the bottom, but I just well, that's all right.
You'll be pleased to know this area has been recently rewired at the expense of some millions of pounds. With the result that we can't switch the lights.
Oh, it's probably the
It's centrally controlled with room booking, so when the time for the room is finished, the lights go out.
Oh, that's all right. Well, let me know if there's anything you can't see. I think for the most part it should be okay, unless there's any bits at the bottom. This is the revised title I give my talk, Data Curation in the Network Humanities. And there's also down here, ullyot.ucalgaryblogs.ca, a place where you can find a posted version of this talk. That's the URL. If there are comments or questions that you've got afterward that we don't get to in the question period, then please, by all means, post them in the comments field at the bottom of that entry, which has the title, Data Curation title here. I'm really grateful to Willard McCarty and Claire Warwick for the invitation to come here, and Andrew Prescott for hosting me today. This talk, Data Curation in the Network Humanities, is part of the first phase of a larger project called Encoding Shakespeare, a project that is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Between now and 2015, I am working to improve the automated encoding of early modern English texts in order to enable text analysis. I'm here tonight to posit my project's ultimate goal and to ask you if my protocols and my platform for encoding Shakespeare are going to help me to reach them. I come here in the spirit of open source research to speak frankly about my doubts and my ignorance about this domain of computational linguistics and programming that are necessary to my success. I come here to ask you what I should address and how in order to answer my questions, and beyond them, to ask you which questions I've forgotten, both in transit and in setting my destination. This paper has three parts. First, I'm going to address the potential of algorithmic text analysis. Secondly, the problem of messy data. And finally, the protocols for network humanities data curation system. The third part is really the most tentative as of this writing, as of this presentation, because fall 2012 is about defining my protocols and identifying which tags the most text analysis engines will require for the best results, whatever that might entail. So I'm very grateful for your comments and any resources you can point me to. But I'll start with a preface to set out the queries I'd like my research ultimately to enable. Queries that start with a process that rectifies the problem that Charles Babbage once identified, that, as he puts it, machinery has been taught arithmetic instead of poetry. First, what does it mean to be a literary scholar in 2012? For one thing, it means getting used to the idea that new tools and new digital surrogates at our disposal are enabling new modes of scholarship, modes that are only possible in 2012. We can formulate new questions, submit new queries, search both new texts and new digital surrogates for old texts. We can test hypotheses, we can create new ones by applying digital tools like Wordseer and Voyant and Tapor to digital texts. Telescopes for the mind, is Willard McCarty's homage to Margaret Masterman, as he puts it, extending our perceptual scope and reach, transforming our conception of the human world, just as in the 17th century the optical telescope set in motion a fundamental rethink of our relation to the physical one, he writes. And yet, as Andrew Prescott's own Electric Current of the Imagination address reminds us, today's radio telescopes are gathering more data in a day than is in all the world's national libraries. Nevertheless, we're looking through our telescopes at texts as quantitative objects, which can be unfamiliar to the traditionally trained humanist. McCarty again reminds us of the fundamental dependence of any computing system on an explicit, delimited conception of the world or model of it. The models that we look at are those familiar to computational and statistical linguists, but they can be unfamiliar to traditionally minded literary critics who tend to consider all linguistics as, quote, the operating system of language, as pre-interpretive and pre-critical, as McGann and Samuels write in their essay, as a means to higher order interpretation. By quantitative objects, I mean not just a series of zeros and ones, but as a data set of words that can be numbered, listed, visualized, and otherwise rearranged or deformed by quantitative criteria, linguistic categories, frequencies, relationships, contexts, tenses, speakers, etc. How easily quantities slip into qualities is another topic. These deformations, in Samuels and McGann's phrase, these deformations disrupt our usual progress through text and reveal relationships between words and other addressable components that may be widely dispersed. I use the term addressable from Michael Whitmore. It means, quote, one can query a position within the text at a certain level of abstraction, genre, individual lines of print, parts of speech. Statistical text analysis is simply an automated mode of address, recognizing what the philosopher Montaigne Maillassou, whom Whitmore quotes, calls those aspects of the object that can be formulated in mathematical terms. These mathematical aspects, Whitmore continues, quote, can be meaningfully conceived as properties of the object in itself. Pairing massive addressability with future tokenizations and new statistical procedures, Whitmore concludes that, quote, something that is arguably true now about a collection of texts can only be known in the future. To read a text is to initiate these addresses, as Whitmore writes. Reading might be described as the continual redisposition of levels of address. To read critically is to gather quantities of evidence from text that sort into our qualitative/interpretive categories. Algorithms can accelerate this gathering by simplifying it. We can use algorithmic text analysis on linguistically encoded text to reveal evidence for new interpretations, to confirm or deny the hunches with which literary scholars often start their research. What kind of hunches? Well, when we quantify our qualitative inquiries, we can make counterintuitive arguments. Consider Shakespeare's use of genre. Jonathan Hope and, again, Michael Whitmore recently used docuscope and its statistical procedure of principal component analysis, or PCA, to identify 101 language action types, or LATs, in Shakespeare's plays. These are things like uncertainty, disclosure, fear, sadness, reassurance, confrontation, question, denial, aside, and so on. So Martin Mueller describes docuscope as, quote, a very large dictionary of short phrases or grammatical patterns that are mapped to a taxonomy of about 100 micro-rhetorical acts. These 101 LATs, again that's language action types, are in 17 clusters comprising 51 dimensions. So, I'm reading from the documentation. The first person options cluster conveys the perspective of a unique entity looking out on the world from the inside. Its 4 LATs are first person, self-disclosure, self-reluctance, and autobiography. Here, in the opening 1,000 words of Shakespeare's Richard III, this cluster is highlighted in red. Kind of difficult to see, but it's up here at the top. So these are words and phrases like I am, my, me, I'll, and myself. By identifying both significant and consistent differences between Shakespeare's comedies and histories, then Hope and Whitmore made, quote, genre visible on the level of the sentence. A technique that led them to conclude that Othello is, at least linguistically, more comic than tragic. Here we're looking at 2 images from their 2010 Shakespeare Quarterly essay. When you compare these scatter plots of the LATs in Shakespeare's 4 principal genres, it's clear that while Othello, which are the blue dots in the right graph, trends toward the upper right quadrant, so comedies, which are the red dots in the left graph, while tragedies, the orange dots in the left graph, a little hard to see in this light, the genre that this plays, narrative, and centuries of critical consensus assigned to it tend to the upper left. So what gives a text like Othello its genre? Is it the narrative that unfolds and its resemblance to other narratives that we assign the labels tragedy and comedy? Resemblance, of course, is essential to categorization, but resemblance to what? Hope and Whitmore offer quantitative evidence that these linguistic categories offer at least another dimension to a text beyond its narrative. As they write, digitally based research in the humanities expands the possibility of iterative comparison because it is more productively indifferent to linear reading and the powerful directionality of human attention. Statistical tools also can reconfirm the qualitative judgments of linear reading. That's one implication of Hope and Whitmore's phrase, productively indifferent. I love that line. Productively indifferent to linear reading and the powerful directionality of human attention. Say you've read a number of Shakespeare comedies and couldn't help but notice most of them end in marriages. And so you formulate a broad theory of comedy. The theme of the comic, I'm quoting, the theme of the comic is the integration of society, which usually takes the form of incorporating a central character into it. By the way, you are Northrop Frye. Did I mention that? Writing your seminal 1957 text, Anatomy of Criticism. You notice how many characters assert their desires to unite with other characters. That's one step along the way from conflict to reconciliation that comedies are about, with marriages serving as the ultimate end of social harmony. How, for instance, do characters shift in the course of a given comedy from using singular first-person pronouns, I, me, you, he, she, etc., to plural ones, we, they, their, etc. Jonathan Hope has written about this. Quote, Shakespearean comedies typically involve people arguing about things, striving to arrive at a we of agreement, but not being able to until the final scene. And in an excellent follow-up post, Anupam Basu has charted this quantitatively, and that's on the slide. So it's possible to quantify the evidence of emerging communal identities in comedies by considering all early modern plays, isolating the comedies, and addressing evidence like first-person pronouns. You, that is the computer, count up these instances, and then you, the critic, write a nuanced qualitative argument from quantitative data. Here's one concern with this system. Surely digital humanists are doing more than retreading old ground by quantitatively proving or testing the qualitative claims of past criticism. Fry's assertion was in 1957, after all, and it would be a poor measure of our discipline's progress to say that by 2012, we can only reaffirm his claim by pointing to a chart. Equally, how are we moving beyond search, however comprehensive it is, when we find and compare every instance of a word and its synonyms? There's certainly value in the movement from a constellation of instances or citations to a machine-enabled aggregation of every instance of a word and its cognates, say, or of a stanzaic and metrical pattern, or of a topic. I can foresee that a new history of the sonnet would be possible, for instance, with these tools. Each of these queries begins with a local reading and extends outwards. So Fry starts with, say, Midsummer Night's Dream, and then reads other comedies. We are only broadening our circumference when we use enhanced search tools. But let's look instead to the methods of a scholarship that originates in algorithmic deformations. Say in heat maps that visualize topics over the careers of a given set of writers. For argument's sake, make them few enough to fit legibly onto a single screen. Say, just the World War I poets, or just the Jacobean clergymen. Sort those topics by a range of criteria, say the writer's age, the text's length or its form, maybe its medium of delivery, print, manuscript, oral recitation. It's not hard to imagine that in these visualizations we might see or recognize some quality that linear readings wouldn't find. People like Stephen Ramsey in Reading Machines have written about this method, reasserting that deformations and quantifications can be the source of hypotheses and interpretations beyond their function of testing or substantiating the hunches that we get from linear readings. These two functions then, of provocation and of expansive rearrangement, should always be in productive tension. So, what kind of research queries do I aim to provoke or enable by encoding Shakespeare as a training set for algorithms to grasp early modern language uses? As I say, I'm here to pose questions that lead to my destination and help me clarify what that destination is. Start with the premise that poetry distinguishes itself from other kinds of language use by adhering to a given set of constraints: verse forms, meter, rhyme, syntax, and other conventions combine in various ways to distinguish poetry from, say, sermons or contracts or other forms of equally constrained language. One advantage to working with early modern poetry is that it predates more difficult innovations like found poetry or free verse. I said that these constraints will combine in various ways to account for the characteristic differences of generic convention or stylistic preference or textual influence or even adaptation, linguistic register, subject matter, and so on in an infinite list. For instance, John Milton's Latinate syntax often places verbs at the ends of his sentences in Paradise Lost, both because he's writing an epic and because of his education. So if conventions combined in various ways make poetry's language poetic, are these conventions that a machine could recognize and disentangle? And if so, could we quantify what makes Paradise Lost a Miltonic, epic, written, in Latinate, blank verse, and pentameter. Well, each of these 5 descriptive features is an opportune problem for current and future algorithms, and these are just the 5 that I can come up with. So if we isolated these features and overlaid a filter or a lens on Milton's text, we could visualize and quantify what distinguishes his poetry from, say, Spencer's, and his poetry from, say, his prose pamphlets, and so on. This function is predicated on a definition of poetry as language constrained or confined by conventions, many of which may defy algorithms for some time. But if Hope and Whitmore can assert a linguistic model for genre, can claims about textual influence or adaptation be far behind? The point is to go beyond what is obvious to a competent critic, to automate base level detections. These lines are blank verse, so that we can set the algorithms loose on text that we haven't read, and to identify features that are extensible beyond poetry, like, say, rhetorical figures. These are maybe the ones that interest me most. What are these figures from anadiplosis to brachylogia to chiasmus, all the way through the alphabet to zeugma? But what are these figures but linguistic patterns and aberrations from ordinary style, ordinary usage? Give a machine enough ordinary text, and it can flag and catalog the repetitions, the ellipses, and the other departures from that baseline. And it can do so in any contemporary string of verse or prose. That's what it means to be a literary critic in 2012, or perhaps 2015. You don't have to do this quantifying if you choose not to, but then you'll lack the evidence that turns linear reading and directionality, as Hope and Whitmore say, into something that's less refutable. It means that we can do a new kind of reading, distant reading, or, quote, understanding literature, not by studying particular text, but by aggregating and analyzing massive amounts of data. That's from a New York Times profile of Franco Moretti. It's, of course, familiar to us. It's already also called things like algorithmic criticism, that's Stephen Ramsey's phrase, macroanalysis, in Matthew Chaucer's phrase. Our training in those particular texts gives us the expertise to drill into the data, to identify the broad ideas in narrow evidence, and to reject false positives. Of course, this criticism was possible before 2012, but now we can run algorithms on online text repositories from our laptops. Which brings me to the data itself. These capabilities of our tools are enormous. So too are the numbers of digitized texts that we can exercise them on. To take just my own field, early modern English literature, the corpus that the Text Creation Partnership is publicly releasing over time, from 2015 to 2020, is an extraordinary trove of data. Searchable transcriptions of some 70,000 texts, or as in Andrew Hardy's estimation, about roughly 1 billion words. They comprise what Martin Mueller has called the Book of English, from the beginning of print in the 1470s to the end of the 17th century. And for that reason, at the Renaissance Society of America in the spring of 2012, Jonathan Hope called this, quote, the most important humanities project in the Anglophone world in 100 years. The term Book of English, I said, was from Martin Mueller, who's done more for the digital analysis of early modern English text than I think any scholar. He developed the New Post tag set for Morphadorner, which can tag each word's standard spelling, its part of speech, that is adjective, adverb, conjunction, noun, preposition, pronoun, verb. Its lemma, that is identifying hung as the past participle of hang. It's also capable of recognizing some 350,000 spelling variants of early modern English words, a capability that was harnessed by his text analysis program, WordFord, which Jonathan Hope recently used to provoke new questions about Hamlet. You might notice my repeated citations of Mueller's work. That's because my thinking about the barriers to exploration has been repeatedly influenced by him, just as my sense of its potential began with my use of his tools. Tools that rely on not just a lot of data, but good data, reliable, accurate, and mostly error-free transcriptions of the text for which they are surrogates. The TCP's data is very, very good, but not perfect, as I'll discuss in a moment. What it needs is data curation, or managing and promoting the use of data from its point of creation to ensure it is fit for contemporary purpose and available for discovery and reuse. As Mueller wrote last month, curation is the servant of exploration. So there are at least 3 barriers then to distant reading or algorithmic criticism or macro analysis, or whatever your term is, of early modern English texts. First is the limitations of primary data, in this case the TCP transcribed early modern English texts. The second is the limitation of metadata, or the linguistic/interpretive encoding that overlies the primary data. And the third, most intractable, is the limited ability of quantifiable data to address qualitative inquiry. There may be something ineffable about literature that can't be parsed by algorithms alone. I'm going to set this fundamental problem aside for now and think about whether it's a problem of digital inquiry that's worth addressing, or maybe like epistemology, it's too disabling. In this case, it might be too romantic to be disabling. I'll now elaborate then on these first 2 problems in turn. It's worth reiterating about the primary data that the TCP's data is far more enabling than it is problematic. And I've repeatedly used the search function to explore the usage of particular words and their cognates. Lateral thinking, citing different occurrences that reveal different valences of a word, gives your interpretations weight and subtlety. For instance, when I have a student in the classroom who asks about the word surfeit in Dr. Faustus, I can cite for Orsino's opening line in Twelfth Night. With the Oxford English Dictionary and the TCP at hand, a diligent undergraduate can surfeit her own curiosity about both the historical meanings and the usage context of particular words. But Mueller's premise in a recent blog post sums it up well. Quote, "The TCP is a magnificent but flawed project." And that's because its transcriptions of these 70,000 texts are imperfect. How imperfect? Well, just taking early modern drama as a subset, as he does, the error rate is about 0.5% of individual words. By my computations, he writes, the error rate for 284 plays goes all the way from a top of 8.8% for Wealth and Health, a text of 7,645 words from 1554, to 0.01% for 7,619 words of The Old Wives' Tale from 1590. The median value is 0.5%. He continues, there are 101 texts with an error rate of less than 0.2%. On the other hand, there are 90 texts with an error rate of more than 1%, and 40 texts with an error rate of 2% or more. Statistics tell us only part of the story, so Mueller offers various examples. The broader problem is what he calls, quote, the negative halo effect that spreads from error-ridden pages and undermines trust in the resource. Now let's think about metadata. Quantifications of qualitative inquiry, like these inquiries into Othello's genre that I mentioned before, depend on thorough and accurate metadata. If we want to analyze all the questions, for example, that include proper nouns in a play like The Married Wives of Windsor, we need to identify every proper noun in the play, like the word Windsor, and isolate those that appear in the sentences that are identified as questions. Likewise, if we want to count Hamlet's neologisms, that is the characters, words that have not been used previously, we need to tag both a set of speeches as Hamlet's and a set of words as neologistic. In Mueller's very elegant phrase, our goal is this, the algorithmic amenability of the digital surrogate, its capacity for being variously divided or manipulated, combined with other texts for the purposes of cross-corpus analyses, having data derivatives extracted from or levels of metadata added to it. Natural language processing, or NLP, can automate much of this encoding by identifying grammatical relationships or finding words in a historical dictionary, but its algorithms give much more accurate results for texts composed after 1700, when English spelling, orthography, and usage were more standardized. For example, in the sentence at the left in this slide, upper left, quote, "I pawn my credit and my honor," from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3. The Stanford parser, which is an automated part-of-speech tagger that's trained on modern English, tags my credit as possessive, P-O-S-S is the code, but not mine honor. It treats mine as a noun, N-N. That's here. So you have mine, N-N here, but possessive, P-R-P, right there. Even the best trained algorithms have difficulty isolating the proper nouns in Shakespeare's sentences when he uses them interchangeably as nouns and verbs. Like this one at the right from Richard II, grace me no grace, nor uncle me no uncle. I made these discoveries, by the way, while working with a tool called Wordseer, which is extremely capable, very highly capable tool and a visualization engine that was developed by Aditi Muralidharan at UC Berkeley. You can go to Wordseer. If you Google that name, you'll find it. So, the distance between early modern and modern English is a large problem, but it's also a tractable one. The solution is to train the NLP algorithms to recognize more linguistic conventions of early modern English than they do currently, so that we can automate the encoding process as much as possible. The Stanford parser, as I showed you, can already handle Chinese, Arabic, and modern English. Its training set for the latter was the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. To extend this to early modern English, I propose to use Shakespeare's complete works as a training set. My aim is to achieve for Shakespeare the 95 to 97% tagging accuracy that the best NLP algorithms can achieve for modern English usage. Rayson and others have achieved at Lancaster have achieved up to 89% tagging accuracy with Shakespeare using 1,000 word training sets from 4 of Shakespeare's comedies by regularizing and modernizing their spelling and then manually editing the output of an NLP program. My project, Encoding Shakespeare, has proposed to expand the training set to all of Shakespeare's works, narrowing the gap between 89% and 97% is achievable with the right protocols, so it's vital to get these right. An important question is exactly which linguistic or other features of Shakespeare's text I'm proposing to encode. The answer has 2 parts. First is whatever features are readily extensible from Shakespeare's 865,185 words to the billion words in the TCP's book of early modern English. And secondly, whatever features are the most amenable to text analysis algorithms now and in the future. How to identify these, either of these, is my most significant barrier right now. I need to learn more about how to choose a training set and what to do with that text to make its features scalable to the text that are my object. Certainly, I propose to do more than is possible, after all. Man's reach should exceed his grasp, as Matthew Arnold once put it. So the question of how to refine my goals is actually threefold. First, which features are extensible and to what? To which texts? Secondly, which features do present and future text analysis tools need to learn from us, that is, from human readers, from domain experts? And thirdly, where to begin in the next 2.5 years, the first phase, what I hope is a multi-phase project. My current thinking about the linguistic constraints on poetry and its departures from ordinary, that is, contemporary language, will help to address these 3 problems. First, narrowing the focus to poetry still offers a good proportion of Shakespeare's text, chosen for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. And the linguistic features of poetry are predicated, I think, on constraints or limits that may lend themselves more readily to machine reading. Secondly, Hope and Whitmore's work with Docuscope shows that current algorithms can do a great deal with wholly unencoded texts, as they do. But they can't, that is not yet, isolate surface-level details like rhetorical figures, meter, or rhyme, let alone more complicated intertextual features like influence or adaptation. I might be wrong, I hope so. So please tell me if current engines, current algorithms can do that and how I can talk to their developers. So these are things that the text analysis tools need to learn from us. The third problem was where to begin in the immediate future, and here I propose the following 3 steps. First, identify the widest possible range of linguistic features that make poetry poetic. This will serve as a kind of wish list. Second, narrow this list to those few features that are readily quantifiable. For instance, meter is a quantity, syllables, right? Tone is much more difficult. And third, choose from this narrowed list the features that seem the most scalable, feasible, and necessary. That is, scalable from Shakespeare to the TCP text, or rather to TCP poetry. Secondly, feasible to be recognizable by a machine and teachable using the protocols that I will outline in a minute. And necessary to exceed the capabilities of current automated systems and to enable new processes that spark new queries. All very open-ended at the moment, but that's the nature of research. So now on to my protocols. What protocols will Encoding Shakespeare follow? How will this project improve the automated encoding of early modern English language? In the final section of my paper, I'm going to describe the ideas I have had about my protocols based on the problems I identified with part-of-speech tags in WordSeer's reliance on the Stanford parser. Phase 1 is iterative tweaking for error reduction. I propose to start by breaking down the problem of language into constituent problems of words, of spelling, of morphology, word formation, and of grammatical relationships in parts of speech. I propose this division not because it makes a large problem addressable, but because it makes the solution a partnership between fast, narrow algorithms and slow, nuanced human readers. I adapted this methodology from recent computational linguistics research, which has shown for 17th century legal documents at least that, quote, an iterative approach to NLP model building, along with the injection of domain-specific knowledge, can produce robust systems for processing non-contemporary corpora and texts. The first step is morphological tagging, which is going to use the Morphadorner program to tag each word's standard spelling, its part of speech, again, adjective, adverb, conjunction, noun, preposition, pronoun, verb, and its lemma. That, again, this is identifying hung as the past participle of hang. My initial purpose is to encode standard forms, meanings, and dependent relationships. A comparative study has described Morphadorner as the best tool for tagging parts of speech. Manually editing all these tags would be really time-consuming if you're going to enact the process just once. But I propose to repeat the process many times and to distribute the editing among online users. I want to balance computational analysis with human readers, a balance that will help improve text encoding until errors like mine honor are vanishingly rare. If Morphadorner misses Shakespeare using a noun as a verb, for instance, destruction straight shall dog them at the heels, a reader can tag the correct part of speech when it identifies the standardized spellings, like substitutions of 2 V's for a W, for instance, or I for J, that sort of thing. A reader who's versed in early modern typographic conventions can readily confirm or correct it. The aim is to make any correction just once, to train the algorithm to recognize words like dog as a verb in a sentence like I quoted, so it recognizes the next one, for instance, in uncle me, no uncle. Phase 2 is crowdsourcing. Even if we limit our data set to Shakespeare's complete works, as I'm proposing to do in phase 1, the task of codifying his usage and correcting errors is itself susceptible to error. If our human reader, for instance, mistakenly misreads dog as a noun, or worse, tags it as a variant spelling of another word like dodge, the error will just proliferate through the algorithm. So the solution is crowdsourcing or networked human computing, dividing a large task into discrete questions or a large text into segments, distributing them to a number of readers and aggregating them in a way that allows the computer to compare results before accepting them. It's not as simple as duplicating tasks, as Babbage recognized in the 19th century. The system has to find different ways to perform the same result. So the mistaken dodge them at the heels might be rejected after a comparison to a string like the dogs of war. I adopt this method from the network science model of human computation, where it's been used for very large problems like galaxy classification and protein folding, problems that require human expertise and judgment to train computers to recognize what we recognize, to think as we do. Encoding Shakespeare has proposed to invite users to examine sections of a text with clearly visible markup. A sonnet, for instance, or 3 sentences from a speech. Users will correct this markup and add their own annotations using an embedded tool. What tool it is, I don't know yet. I will investigate different tools like CADMA, the computer-aided textual markup and analysis, to find one that's transparent and easy to use, and of course whose encoding meets TEI and open annotation collaboration specifications so that other people can use it. Many users will be students and other non-specialist readers. Studies have shown the effectiveness of non-expert annotations for natural language tasks. And Mueller's catalog of what he calls the careful and literate readers who might contribute to collaborative curation is inspirational. He writes, high school students in AP classes, undergraduates, teachers, scholars, other professionals, amateurs from many walks of life, and a particularly important group, educated retirees with time on their hands and desire to do something useful. This is my rationale for choosing Shakespeare, which I promised to explain, because his texts are the most widely taught in the idiom of early modern English poetry, and because that idiom is my ultimate object. Why? Because it's my specialty, but also because the TCP texts are coming. The crowdsourcing model has been successfully implemented in social science and humanities projects, particularly historical projects that focus on language transcription. At the January 2012 American Historical Association annual meeting, for instance, there was a panel called Crowdsourcing History, where there were 9 projects from historians and software developers focusing on open source tools and techniques for transcribing a range of historical material: naturalists' field notes, American Civil War diaries, and author-specific manuscripts. More locally, of course, since early 2010, the 1,508 registered users of the Transcribe Bentham project at UCL have transcribed 45% of the 5,580 manuscripts of Jeremy Bentham. And in the LLC article in issue 27, volume 27, issue 2, they addressed how they had the issues of administration and oversight in order to ensure themselves the quality of what they were getting. But they have set an invaluable precedent and set up invaluable protocols for people to follow them. But transcription doesn't go far enough for my purposes. A model that might be more analogous is the UCL graduate student Alexandra Evely's work on collaborative descriptions of material in the National Archives. And the United States' own National Archives Citizen Archivist Dashboard experiment. Another precedent for my proposed system is Analects, the tool that Mueller and Craig Berry developed a few years ago. Thanks to their suggestions and to Twitter, I've also learned about 2 more recent projects that I didn't have time enough to look at, each at different phases. Typewrite is one of them here, and EMOP, the early modern OCR project. My goal from now to 2015 is to complement and augment their plans and capabilities, not to repeat their work. Mueller conceives of his project's future in inspirational terms when he says, we need a social and technical space of collaborative curation, where individual texts live as curatable objects continually subject to correction, refinement, or enrichment by many hands, and coexisting at different levels of imperfection. To conclude, my ultimate goal is to develop an extensible and intelligent model of the early modern English language. Extensible because it'll take linguistic conventions from a limited data set and learn from the variations that each new text offers. And intelligent because it'll teach machines to encode text more like human experts would do. So these machines can provoke us to to read and think and inquire more definitively. In our remaining time, I hope we can address some of the questions that I've raised about my aims and methodology, but most importantly, to raise the questions that I have forgotten, dodged, or distorted. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a presentation that in a way goes beyond what the abstract offers in the way that the best presentations do, because you've taken the specific aims of your computing project and used that as a springboard. First, to provide us with a very thought-provoking, critical and authoritative overview of some of the issues around the nature of distant and quantitative reading that's starting to emerge. But also then led us through to think about some of the underlying, and as you say, very much inspired by Michael Muller's work, the underlying data curation issues around that, and then how we grapple with that. And I like very much the idea of the extensible approach. I was particularly struck by your reference to Muller's discussion of the text creation partnership and that sort of thing in two ways. Maybe I'll get the first one out of the way because it doesn't actually necessarily lead to a comment on the paper. But I think it's worth bearing in mind because it reflects on the first part of your paper that you were talking about very much the tools of 2012 and what we could do in 2012. In a way that is saying, here, how lucky we are to be able to do our PowerPoint on an iPad and have all this technology at our disposal. But if you look at the text creation partnership, what a sorry mess we've made of it, in the sense that we've started off with creating an online version of books in the English short title catalogue through early English books online. And first of all, we thought we'd do it from microfilm for various reasons. That's actually not giving us a very good image. Second, it never occurred to us that people might want to search the text while we were creating it, and so we didn't do that. So it's not in the commercial package. And then afterwards, we have to get the University of Michigan to seek funding and with volunteer help to keyboard all the things that have already been made available online. So we've done it consistently in a very cack-handed fashion, and now we're talking about cleaning it up by applying further crowdsourcing to that. So actually, kind of on reflection, we've got wonderful tools available, but we've actually created those tools in a very hit-and-miss and cheap-by-jam fashion. So that's a background, really. What struck me more was Muller's comments about your very important comments about the high quality of text creation partnership, but its inherent limitation once you start to apply quantitative technique, because so much stuff is missed out. I think that's fascinating, because the figures that Muller applies there are actually less stringent than those we apply in the conversion of library catalogues. I was involved in the conversion of the printed British Museum catalogue of printed books into a machine readable form. And the contract, which is one of the strictest ever drawn up for that sort of thing, specified something like it was a 0.75% error rate in the conversion of books. But actually, if you apply that across 11 million books, that's an awful lot of books that disappear in exactly the same way that Muller refers to. So you've kind of got an illusion of perfectibility here that distorts the whole thing. Because even if you could get the text creation partnership text right through the application of crowdsourcing, even then there would be wider global errors affecting it, such as the fact that there'll be some STC books that have disappeared altogether from the record because of the error levels that we set when we were converting the library catalogues. And on top of that, there's the fact that TCB is one copy. and copies vary in the early modern period. So within that context, you're sort of suggesting, I like the idea of extensibility, but you're still, it seems to me, hankering after perfectibility. And I wonder whether actually the logical conclusion of your extensibility is that you accept that there's always going to be a variability and a vagueness in your results, and what the implications of that are for your methodology.
You actually have two other issues with TCP text. One is that there are also all these manuscripts that were ever print. Of course, so we think about this is just one copy of everything that happened to have been printed in these years. And the other issue, I guess, well, not the TCP stuff, but is also whatever encoding we lay into it is going to be imperfect. It's going to have false positives, have etc. Missing bits that are not there. I use the phrase, our inquiries can be more definitive, and that was a dodge because it wasn't supposed to be. It's not. It's getting to be more toward the illusion or the promise of a definitive kind of search, a definitive kind of body of evidence. But this is always illusory and always imperfect. The illusion of perfectibility is definitely is very much there. The trouble, of course, one of the issues, I don't know what else to say except that you're absolutely right, and that these are moving us into, these kinds of projects are moving us into a realm of greater, wider, broadening horizons, but the map will always be smaller than the territory by necessity, and all we can do is just fill in its gaps and do our best with imperfect copies of things. Not even copies of things, imperfect approximations of things, I guess. There are issues in the first bit that you raised with the microfilms, some of which date from the 1930s, not being transcribed at the time. And part of that is that it would have been it wasn't the mandate, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it never occurred to, again, I was involved in some of the other projects on that. We just thought it would be really useful because it was we were used to grappling with microfilm, and we thought, oh, God, it'd be really neat if we had the microfilm on the screen instead of having to grapple with it. But the idea that then you want to search the text didn't actually occur to us at that point.
Now, things like TCP and things like the early modern OCR project would not be possible, I think, without the PDFs, without the digitization of those microphones. So yes, we're still, while a lot has been built on the foundation, just as the digitizations would not have been possible without the initial microphone, and so on back then.
Well, the whole, in a sense, the whole enterprise springs from the STC activities. That's the root of the whole thing.
Which itself springs from the invention of print. The decision to print.
Anyway, I mustn't hog the discussion. I'm sure there was comments from others. Questions?
Good problem. I'm coming at this completely from a not digital end, but more on the editorial, textual side. But it seems that with Shakespeare in particular, contemporary editorial theory is moving towards even more textual instability. So many more editions. Like when you say canon, I'm already going, well, you've got King Lear on there once. Which King Lear are you using? They're now looking at Othello, Q1 and F have significant differences. And then when you said that there would be kind of a collaborative annotation and updating, are you going to let people go back and forth and change sullied and solid, depending on, what they like and what for, which is kind of a piddly detail. But for someone that, is looking at it as being in that era, there's such textual instability. It seems like to make this work, we need to package it into some kind of a stable form, but then re-release it into a different kind of unstable form, which I guess I'm just wondering how you see that working, because I'm thinking, oh, this is great, but how can I use it? When, as a text scholar, I'm already thinking there are all these different collaborative agents that are at play, and, what do I, and I'm always wondering, which text are you using, which is a very important question, especially, in Shakespeare, but, in most other modern texts, which I don't know if that's a question, but it's kind of amusing.
It's another problem. You're right. The instability of the text means that this is never, ever going to be a definitive, that word, I don't like that word, but I'm going to use it again and again, a definitive encoding of Shakespeare, because what is the text that we're talking about, of course? So it should not and must not ever try to be that. It can only try to find the extensible bits of Shakespeare that can extend outward into the body of TCP poetry. Let's just be less ambitious than I was saying. But it's just the poetry, which is itself a crazy ambition. Just to take certain elements. So just to start with a certain text that we will have to more or less take the unstable texts and stable bits and pieces and set them aside. And that, unfortunately, it's going to change the data. It's going to change the starting set of data that you're dealing with. It's not a very satisfying methodology, because the methodology really ought to be much more principled than that, right? It should be, these are the extensible ones. This is where the other category of words I use, the ones that can really, are really doing things the algorithms can't do without humans. I mean, I used to take this sullied, solid flesh would melt line and figure out exactly where is that happening elsewhere.
I just did a lot of work on Q2 Othello, which does a lot of combining, and just shows you all these places where there's two different choices, and
Well, I wonder what happens with that kind of quantitative analysis that you were showing us by Jonathan Hope and others. If you apply it to different versions of the text, do the results still hold up?
That's this one here. I don't know. They're using the Globe Shakespeare, I believe. Which which is like, what, 19th century, right? It's pretty old.
But then why would you take that and not go back to like a Quarto or a Folio? Because there's editorial intervention.
Because it can become more than stylistics then, in a sense, because it can be used as a means of trying to indicate maybe some of the things that are going on in the back quarters, as to what's happening there, which you can get that at a certain level of detail, but to get that at a big level, what you were saying about how doing more than linear reading is quite difficult in that sort of context.
The difficulty is that they are taking each of these is a 1,000-word bit that they've taken out of a text. Now, you can see, as I said, a lot of the comedies, the lights on this is very difficult. These are orange ones here. You can sort of see the difference between orange and red, I hope, a little bit. A lot of the comedies are sort of moving up there. Tragedies are moving over here, kind of. Anyway, if you take these bits, first of all, if you started adding in the back quarters, you could start doing that, right? Because you could take them, strip out everything that isn't put up tragedies, right? And then see how.
I think how that shifted might be interesting.
It's in another dimension.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just think of the difference between the to be or not to be with the short Hamlet.
There's the point.
That's going to give you an amazingly different result.
I mean, one of the boons with Shakespeare with this kind of study is that degree of, there's already been so much study of that degree of detail that you've got some research questions you can readily look into, as you already indicated.
That's right. So there are certain texts that you would, it's giving you a certain amount of stability. Arguably, he's the most, stable is the wrong word. That's a file. It's very studied.
Can you strip out the stage directions, some of the earlier ones which are arguably supposed to have been put in there, Shakespeare himself, and they count as part of the text? Going back to these as well. The stage directions, the sorts of things that there's lots of scholarly debate about whether they're actually put in there by Shakespeare himself and are his directions or subject to later editions. My background is in classics. I didn't have this problem because we just say, I'm using the Oxford classical text. But my familiarity with Martin Movement, of course, is through the Chicago Homer and the work that way. And that was leading on to something serious. I've completely forgotten what it was. But what I would say is this was very reminiscent. I was just thinking about my earlier work all the way through this and how I would have loved something like this, because I was doing analysis on obvious metamorphosis, and of course using a Latin text which I had in electronic version. I could do things like word searching, comparative searching, looking for illusions. But I was working in King's, and of course Willard was there, so we used to have these long conversations where he would say to me, Simon, yes, but how can you tell? What are the linguistic markers that this guy is using? How do you know this is really using the words for, I was looking at sort of emotion, strong passion and emotion, so I'm looking at things, issues like episodes of love, anger, hate. And Willard's just saying to me, yes, but what markers does Ovid give? How does he actually signal us in advance? Okay, I'm looking at the word forms, and I never had a tool to do anything like that. One of my close friend of mine and a fellow graduate student at the time was actually marking up Willard's text, electronic text, word by word by word by word. I think it was 3 years Willard employed her for. So that way she's marking up, being a language expert, of course Willard wasn't, a Latinist expert, actually marking up every single word. This is a preposition, this is a noun, this is an adjective. If it's an adjective, what word does it relate to? And linking those two together. And I would have really loved something like this that could have looked at a much bigger corpus, because I mean, Ovid's work for a Latin text is pretty large. And although you don't have anything to compare it with, it would have been great to be able to use this type of analysis. When I used to do Introduction to Linguistic Analysis with undergraduates, one of the things I always challenged them with was exactly what you said, what makes poetry poetic. And I used to have in the back of my head, I would say, well, what's happening with my Ovid text? How do I know this is going on there? With an ancient text, you know it's poetry because it's presented in this form. It's hexameter poetry, right? And Ovid has these wonderful jokes where he plays with the different structure when he's going from one format to another format, and the metamorphosis is, of course, is a great bit of fun because he's presenting it in the epic format. But you only get that halfway through the second line because it's a gag, right? And it's a change. This whole thing about changing forms. He's changing the form of the poetry by presenting it in an epic form. That's a big digression. A direct question, right? Is one of your earlier slides. A little cause for concern ran up about when you started talking about TCP, you had EBO and TCP, and then ProQuest next to it. So my question was: is this actually going to be open and open source, and is this going to be available, or is it going to be locked away in a sort of ProQuest manner?
I have no. I want it to be as open as possible. I have no constraints, funding constraints, or anything on it being locked away. Let me go back to that slide. Oh, I can't find it now. I think I know the one you mean. It just had the TCP logo. If I use the TCP materials after 2015, which I think is going to take me that long to get this sorted before it gets released, as it were. 2015 to 2020, the dates I mentioned are the dates when TCP must release these files to the wild. So that's the advantage.
I mean, it's quite complex. They are open, and you'll tend to find that most larger universities have signed up to it anyway. For the 18th century, all the text creation partnership full text is available to everyone. At the moment, for early English books online, that's the early modern material, that's available to partners. But any university can sign up to be a partner. So if your university isn't signed up as a partner and you're not getting it in your EBO package, you can get it. And then, as you say, eventually they're going to be released or is quite complex, but they are being opened up. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Will be released in the public domain for anyone to use.
I mean, that's actually an issue if you're thinking about doing your own editions of an early modern text, in the sense that, as it were, a base text is already available with the expiration partnership and covenant, which they generally have.
Yeah.
So you need to bear that in mind if you're thinking about electronic editions.
Yes.
Sorry, at the back, yeah?
Yeah, I just had a question, and maybe this is sort of covered in your paper, but it was just about the sort of nature, you talked about sort of training algorithms and training them on the text. And I was wondering, because I was sort of concerned because you mentioned that, you know, if somebody typed in something wrong, it might screw up the entire algorithm. I wonder if there was any thought of like maybe having sort of multiple algorithms work on a text. I think like an example would be, and I'm not sure if this is, but where, for example, you get you get one that works on the entire body of text and one that works on just a specific subset, and sort of comparing the results. Does that make any sense? Or
Yeah, I think so. Just to back up a second, the Transcribe Bentham people and other crowdsourced projects. Is anyone here from Transcribe Bentham? Okay, so I can speak freely about what I think I know and understand. I believe they have a whole arrangement, and this is the LLC article, partly about this, to kind of give certain users different ratings, as it were, for reliability ratings. Someone's always shown to be very, very reliable and so on, and her transcriptions will always be more or less accepted with just the minimum amount of oversight and so on. However, that doesn't really address your question.
I mean, I was thinking of like in the sort of far future, you know, like generative or sort of smart algorithms that then like sort of evolve through their interaction with other algorithms. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I can
see sci-fi.
I can imagine that an algorithm might be able to say, for example, that this change that you are proposing will have the following large consequences. And the consequences are large enough to be alarming. How exactly you quantify alarming, I don't know. You have to figure out some sort of threshold, whatever. It crosses this threshold and it's becoming too alarming. You're talking about changing all this other stuff. Is that okay? It'll have some kind of fail-safe arrangement to say. Again, we're talking about humans. There's only so far, I think, unless they get really, really super smart, there's only so far you can trust them, right? You have to have a fair amount of oversight, and the goal, of course, is to have as much automated to flag for our attention as possible. I'm not really answering your question. I don't know how to answer.
There are a couple of models for this. Again, in classics, we always go back to pseudo online, which would have various levels of supervision.
What's that called?
Pseudo. I'm going to give you an even better one in a second. But we've grown from that. That was picked up by the Pleiades project in New York University. But there's another one. The guys that run it in Kentucky. It's called Son of Pseudo Online. So it's taking the idea of the pseudo online further, and it has got an elaborate workflow, most of which is automated, that sort of deals with these issues. I know this because the guy who's done all the back end to it, I've edited a chapter by him for my next forthcoming book. That's the only reason I know that. So I don't know the actual details. But it's full, he's at Kentucky, and it's between Kentucky and I think the other guy, the PI, the director, is at Foreman, and it's Son of Pseudo Online.
How do you spell that?
Son of Pseudo,
S-U-D-O-Online.
Pseudo Online. Pseudo is the big Byzantine marginalia document that's been an early crowdsourced project going back from the 80s, I guess. And people get taken on as editors, and they go through like a period of supervision, and they have to work their way out to the higher level. But Son of Pseudo Online sort of does this in some way automatically.
Wow.
I can give you the guy's email address. We were
Yeah,
talking about
that'd
it.
be great.
Yeah, and like as I say, I've edited the chapter, and I don't know how it works. I have a vague schema in my head about how it should operate. This is, I'm trying to think of the guy named the director on the project.
Can I ask
It'll come to me in a few minutes and I'll shout it out.
Okay. Can I ask a broad question? I said that at one point there are various criteria we can sort of apply, like to say poetry is constrained. I think that's a very loose definition of what poetry is. Constrained by what? Meter, rhyme, rhetoric, perhaps, etc. What have I left off my list? I forgot the list. I forgot the list already. That's why I wrote it down. But it was things like it must have a certain pattern. It must have a certain departure from ordinary speech. Did I leave things off that list that seem really essential?
If you put too many words in it, it becomes a prose.
It gets too long.
Well, the structure breaks down, so the prose is more like a paragraph in a way. Text.
So that'd be syllables. We're talking about a certain length of lines.
Good. Well, I think at that point we could actually move towards having a glass of wine. But before that, I should remind you of the date of our next meeting, which I'm just checking because I failed to make a note of it, and it's on the. Come on, these things don't work when you want them to. And now I've just frozen the whole thing.
13th of December?
It's the when?
13th of December?
Did you have, can you...
It's Anne Alexander.
It's Anne Alexander, who's from Crash in Cambridge. And Anne has done some very interesting work on the textuality associated with the Arab Spring and the way in which social media have worked in the Arab Spring, the sorts of texts that are coming out of that. So it's a long way from Shakespeare, but still the same sort of issues. So I hope you'll join us at 5:30 on the 30th.
Thursday the 13th of December.
13th of December.
Room 334, same room.
Yeah, so for Anne, who I think shortly was a very... But could you please thank Michael for answering the group?